I'm now very pleased to introduce and welcome our first speaker, Professor Hank Weiss, for opening remarks. He is a research professor in the Department of Preventive and Social Medicine at the University of Otago and is director of the Injury Prevention Research Unit. He is also the director of the Adolescent Mobility Health Consortium. Professor Weiss has over 30 years' experience in injury control. He received his PhD in epidemiology at the University of Pittsburgh and an undergraduate degree in environmental studies and biology from the University of California. Currently, he focuses on injuries to pregnant women, traumatic brain injury, adolescent motor vehicle injury prevention, and the intersection of safety and sustainability mostly in the area of active transport. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Hank Weiss.
And good morning, everybody, locally and around the world. The following is from a March 2013 letter to the editor from a young University of Otago co-ed. A couple of weeks ago, my flatmate and I completed one of our first gym sessions of the year down at the Unipole by the stadium. And while perhaps the focus here should be on the fact that we took almost 2 months to venture to do some much needed exercise, instead, it's on the awful surprise we received when walking back to our car. While we didn't get a ticket, the parking officer had been walking around our car a few minutes prior. We were confused as to how he came up with all this when everyone knows that the Unipole car park is free, or rather the Unipole car park was free. Sure enough, once directed to it, we saw a meter now at the front of the car park demanding $1 for every hour. It will probably not shock many to hear that as stingy students willing only to spend extra money on food and nights out, we were in absolute uproar about these developments. An entire night in our flat was dedicated to discussing the possible reasons and how much of an inconvenience it would be for us. My flatmate claims, rather ironically, if we were to get fat this year, it would be none other than the gym's fault. Some probably think we should stop complaining and just walk to the gym, or that $1 an hour is a small price to pay for parking, especially in Dunedin when parking can be $3 an hour. These people would be right, because obviously we could walk to the Unipole, and $1 an hour is minimal. But what gets to me about the whole thing more is the inconvenience. Walking to Unipole from where I live takes close to 30 minutes, making it nearly an hour's excursion just getting there and back. Well, this is my reply to Stacey. Dear Stacey, thank you for writing about your inconvenience as a letter to the editor. While I could reply in various ways, some more personal perhaps than others, I'd like to thank you for providing such a great personal story to kick off our second annual Adolescent Mobility Health Symposium. For in your one short letter, you bring up several barriers to modal shift and active transport we're going to hear a lot more about this morning from the experts. You talk about the cost. You talk about the inconvenience, the habit of driving, and perceived time savings. To your credit, you do acknowledge that perhaps you shouldn't complain, and perhaps walking would do you some good. And I would agree with you on both of those points. But Stacey, I would also like to remind you that early in the morning, when you prefer to exercise, Dunedin is a lovely place. The traffic never gets too bad, and before 7:30 a.m., the streets are almost deserted. What I suggest you consider is getting on a bike for the short trip to the university. As our keynote speaker, Todd Lippman, will detail in his keynote, you get there almost as fast, if not faster than a car. You get exercise along the way. You pay nothing for petrol, parking. You save on petrol, and you pollute the environment much less. You may actually learn to enjoy the early morning ride as a time to be treasured. And lastly, you may find that you enjoy cycling as a recreational activity, something that will serve you over your entire lifetime. Or you can keep driving and complaining. The choice is yours to make. Yours truly, Professor Hank Weiss. Now, I don't know exactly how typical Stacey's attitude is towards her transportation issues. I hope she's a minority. We will hear more about that from one of this morning's speakers, Sophia Leon de la Barra, when she reveals the results of a local survey on how high school teens travel. I do know that that changing those kinds of attitudes and encouraging new behaviors is not as simple as it seems for youth, or for that matter, anyone embedded in a car culture. Evidence shows, for example, that for many people, environmental concerns do not always motivate most people to change their behavior. Whether this holds for the future and with today's youth is not yet clear, and I'm sure after our morning break, Brittany Packer will have something to say about that. There is evidence that focusing on personal well-being, attention can be refocused from an intangible, hard-to-perceive future into the present, and from the impact on others to the consequences on oneself. There's also growing evidence that changing attitudes and behaviors needs to focus on one's desires for not only wellness, but other forms of personal gain, such as cost savings, for approval by peers, concern for societal values, i.e. social norms, and fear of adverse consequences. To learn more about these issues, I'm pleased that Jamie Stuckless will join us from Canada to talk about what she's learned about actually engaging with youth to engage and change their travel modes. But two things do greatly disappoint me about Stacey's letter. First is her dual sense of indignation and entitlement. I wonder if she knows that roughly 4 out of every 10 people, when you include children, either cannot drive or do not have access to cars. They are therefore often dependent on walking, cycling, public transport, or getting lifts from friends or families in order to make their journeys. Secondly, is her failure to acknowledge the effects of her choices on others. In fact, increasing car use in New Zealand and many other car-centric societies has made many of the desired alternatives less viable. With traffic-inducing traffic, cycling and walking have come to be seen by many as too dangerous to seriously consider, the so-called suppression effect. The viability of public transport has been eroded by financial competition from private cars as well. Over decades, land use patterns have changed to reflect car use. Services and the suburbs where people lived have often moved to more car-accessible locations, leading to many more and longer journeys. Our society has become dangerously hardwired to increasingly levels of car dependency, while warning signs of its unsustainability from energy and environmental perspectives and health perspectives abound. Transport systems must also respond to the absolute imperative to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Currently, global greenhouse gas emissions are rapidly increasing, passing the symbolic 400 parts per million level this week, when many climate scientists say we should not be exceeding 350. Leading researchers have calculated that unless we can reverse this trend and achieve a downward spiral by 2020, then it will be impossible to limit average global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. If Stacey is tuned in today or gets a chance to see the recording of the symposium, she will get to hear from Brittany Packer talk about these environmental challenges from the youth perspective. So perhaps Stacey was not aware of these and other related issues, and that's entirely possible. The educational system that she grew up in could do a much better job explaining them. But if she watches and listens to today's symposium, Stacey will hear from other young people in the teen panel discussion how they are making different choices in their lives and overcoming some of the barriers that they face. And that's where I think things get interesting. Because Brittany and the teens we hear and will meet this morning grew up in the same culture and the same educational system as Stacey did. But as I said, they have a different perspective and understanding of their role and the impact of transport on their generation's future. Because while reading the attitudes of Stacey, I also know there are many young people like Brittany and the teens you'll meet that gives me hope. For it is the young people still very much in need of our help and support that embody the best chance for enabling the rapid, fundamental changes needed to create a better future. It's been pointed out by others that Isaac Newton was 23 when he saw the apple fall from the tree. Albert Einstein had his most groundbreaking year at age 25, the same age at which Martin Luther King led the Montgomery bus boycott. The King of Bhutan was 17 years old when he made gross national happiness a major indicator of progress for the country and an example for the world, and so on. Many young people are geared by their very nature to make change, if we will only let them. Our sustainability challenges require a new perspective unspoiled by status quo bias. Of course, just being young and confident is not enough. Ignorance and initiative at that age can sometimes be a dangerous combination. But Newton, Einstein, and the King of Bhutan all combined youth with a tireless work ethic. It doesn't come easy. The leaders of tomorrow will need to balance hard work and action with learning. And I encourage them to pursue opportunities for hand-on practice wherever they get the opportunity, whether it's in school, in campus, on campus, or in their private lives. Once they have a plan, they will need to act with confidence if they are to succeed at unsettling the status quo. Finally, I address my remarks not to the young, but to the older members of our society, some of whom are tuned in today. If you're secure in your position, close to retirement, and financially secure, why not use this freedom to stand up for your passions on what is right? In the build-up to the Civil War in the United States, 59-year-old abolitionist John Brown attempted to start a slave uprising with a raid on Harper's Ferry. Mohandas Gandhi, at 73, took a more peaceful approach, leading the civil disobedience movement for independence from Great Britain. In the pursuit of sustainability, I look to people like James Hansen, the decorated climate scientist who in his 60s first became an activist. A new approach to transport policy is urgently needed, one which accommodates complexity, works intelligently with health, social, and environmental impacts, and takes a system-wide view. We need to move away from predict and provide transport planning and work towards choices that are guided by the top goal of a sustainable transport system. This is not an impossible task. Research shows that in many cities, nearly half the drivers say they would like to drive less than they do. Kay Duncan, in a report to the UK Sustainable Development Commission, describes it this way. An ideal transport system enables people of all ages to fulfill their potential and contribute fully to society. It minimizes the negative social and environmental impacts of transport and underpins a thriving, low-carbon, and sustainable economy. It is also resilient to energy security issues, such as raising oil prices, enables us to meet our commitments on climate change, and designs out the problems of congestion. We don't have such a system like that in New Zealand and most other car-centric societies, and we are changing too slowly to get there. Instead, we have a system with all its charms increasingly recognized as having been obtained at a huge cost, the burden of which falls most heavily on the poorest and the most vulnerable. The negative impacts of our high travel intensity includes deaths and injuries. As a safety professional, I know well, with the young, as we heard from Mark, most at risk, and the threat of harm that restricts others' freedoms, air and noise pollution, congestion, community severance, and the loss of social cohesion. These and other impacts, and in particular climate change, will place a heavy burden upon ours and future generations. Today, we essentially have things backwards in New Zealand with regards to current government transport policy. While billions are being borrowed and reallocated to misguidingly addressing capacity increases on the so-called roads of national significance, a sustainable transport hierarchy would place that priority last, instead focusing on demand reduction and then modal shift and efficiency improvements. Social, energy, environmental, and equity impacts of transport expenditures must accompany the current incomplete and flawed cost-benefit analyses used to justify public roading expenditures. Our right to freedom of movement must be exercised without compromising the rights of others to live free from the negative aspects that too much of the wrong type of travel imposes. Our challenge, whether young or old, is to create a system which achieves a better balance between potentially conflicting rights in a way that is equitable for both us and for future generations, and which reflects real environmental limits. Thank you very much.